It was a regular Tuesday morning at Hampton and Wells Bank, nestled on the corner of a quiet but affluent street in the heart of downtown Atlanta. The lobby buzzed with early customers, the soft hum of printers mixing with the scent of fresh coffee. Behind the polished marble counters, employees tapped away at keyboards, smiling at clients and moving papers like clockwork. Everything seemed normal, until she walked in. Dressed in a professional charcoal blazer, sharp heels, and carrying a sleek leather folder under her arm, Alicia Carter moved with quiet confidence. Her presence was calm, but commanding. She stood in line like everyone else, not demanding attention, not asking for special treatment. Just waiting for her turn. But it didn't go unnoticed. As she approached the front desk, the teller's smile dropped just slightly. The manager, Mr. Doug Whitmore, standing behind his glass office door, raised an eyebrow as he glanced at the security monitor. He stepped out a moment later, straightened his tie, and casually whispered something to the teller. The whisper turned into a pause. And the pause turned into a problem. "Ma'am, I'm sorry, but Mr. Whitmore will need to see you himself," the teller said, clearly uncomfortable. "Would you mind taking a seat in the waiting area?" Alicia nodded politely. She didn't ask questions, though she could feel the eyes on her. A couple of other customers exchanged glances. One woman with a designer purse raised her eyebrows and looked away. Alicia sat down in the corner chair, adjusted her folder on her lap, and waited. 5 minutes turned into 20. 20 turned into an hour. The bank lobby thinned out. People who arrived after her were served and left. Still, no one called her name. No one came to explain the delay. When Alicia stood up and calmly approached the counter to check in again, the teller leaned forward, flustered. "I'm really sorry, but Mr. Whitmore is still occupied," she said, eyes flicking nervously toward the manager's office. From inside, Whitmore saw her looking. He didn't move. He just tapped away at his computer, pretending not to notice. Alicia turned back and sat down again, her expression still composed but her fingers tightening around the folder in her lap. At one point, a young intern came out with a tray of water bottles. He offered one to a waiting customer, then hesitated when he got to her. She smiled and reached for it. He quickly moved away. Time ticked on. 2 hours. 2 whole hours. And yet, no call, no explanation. What nobody in that bank knew was that Alicia Carter wasn't just another client. She wasn't there to open a simple account, or to deposit a check. She was there for something much bigger. Outside, the quiet of the street was suddenly broken by the sound of a black SUV pulling into the bank's private parking lot. Then another. The security guard at the front door stood up straighter. 3 sharply dressed individuals stepped out of the vehicles, 2 men and a woman, all with confident strides and ID badges clipped to their blazers. The door opened with a soft chime. The bank fell quiet. Mr. Whitmore looked up from his desk and instantly stood, color draining from his face as he recognized the 3 board members of Hampton and Wells National Branch. His hand twitched as he reached for his tie and straightened it nervously. "Good morning, Mr. Whitmore," said the tall man in the center. "We're here for the meeting, with Ms. Carter." The entire lobby turned. The manager blinked. "Ms. Carter?" he asked, almost too quietly. "Yes," the woman replied, with a knowing smile. "Alicia Carter. Senior Diversity and Ethics Consultant, appointed by the board to evaluate your branch operations." Suddenly, every pair of eyes shifted to Alicia, who now stood up from her seat calmly, folder in hand, and walked toward the stunned group. Whitmore stammered, I didn't know she had arrived. The man in the front didn't even look at him. She's been sitting here for 2 hours. Right in front of your face. You could hear a pin drop. Even the printers seemed to fall silent. Alicia looked the manager in the eye, not with anger, but with quiet, pointed clarity. I was told I needed to wait. So I waited. Whitmore swallowed hard, visibly sweating now. Ms. Carter, please, come into my office. No need, she interrupted gently, we'll use the boardroom. The rest of the staff watched in awkward silence as Alicia walked past the desk, her heels clicking on the marble floor, followed by the board members. The tension was thick, but Alicia carried herself like she had expected every moment of it. What the staff didn't know, and what Mr. Whitmore had failed to learn, was that Alicia had been sent with a purpose. A purpose rooted not just in business, but in experience. Because this wasn't the first time she had been ignored. Or underestimated. Or treated like she didn't belong. It happened in meetings. It happened in stores. And today, it happened in a place where money and status often dictated treatment. But Alicia wasn't here to cause a scene. She was here to watch. To observe. To let people reveal who they really were when they thought no one was watching. And Doug Whitmore had just shown her everything she needed to see. The doors to the boardroom closed behind them, but the weight of what had just happened remained thick in the lobby. The teller who'd spoken to Alicia earlier sank slightly into her chair, biting her lip. The intern stood frozen, still holding the tray of water bottles. One customer who had seen the whole thing quietly packed her things and left. Inside the boardroom, as Whitmore tried to recover his words, Alicia opened her folder and laid out the reports she had been reviewing. Her job wasn't just to conduct an audit. It was to recommend who stayed, and who didn't. As the conversation began, one thing was clear, this wasn't just about business anymore. This was about justice. About fairness. About opening the eyes of those who had forgotten the value of respect. And Whitmore? He was only just starting to realize that the most powerful person in the room was the one he had made wait. What happened next would shake the very foundation of the bank's leadership, but that moment, those silent, uncomfortable 2 hours, would become the turning point in a story that was only just beginning. Inside the boardroom, the air felt heavy. Doug Whitmore stood near the head of the long wooden table, trying to keep his composure, though every second that passed chipped away at his usual confidence. The board members were already seated, and Alicia Carter, calm as ever, took the seat directly across from him. She opened her folder, revealing not just papers, but weeks of detailed observations, client reports, diversity metrics, and employee feedback forms from every branch in the region. Doug shifted on his feet. He glanced at the papers, then at the woman he had made wait for 2 hours. In his mind, he had already started trying to spin it, to find a way to blame it on scheduling, miscommunication, or maybe even the teller. But what he didn't realize was that Alicia had seen it all before, men in his position trying to protect themselves once the spotlight turned their way. "I'm not here to punish anyone, Mr. Whitmore," Alicia said, finally breaking the silence. "But I am here to understand what kind of leadership this branch represents. And whether it aligns with the values of the company." He gave a half smile, awkward and forced. "Of course. I didn't recognize you earlier." She raised an eyebrow. "That's exactly the point, isn't it?" Back in the lobby, word had started to spread among the staff. Whispers passed between desks, exchanged glances between tellers. Most didn't know the full story, but they all knew something had gone wrong. One of the junior associates, a woman named Maya who had only been working there for 6 months, sat frozen at her desk. She had noticed the way Mr. Whitmore had looked at Alicia when she first walked in. It wasn't just oversight. It was dismissal. Maya remembered her own experience when she first joined, how Doug would often skip over her in meetings or barely acknowledge her when clients were around. She thought maybe it was just her imagination. But now, it didn't feel like a coincidence. Alicia, on the other hand, had seen enough of these places to know what patterns looked like. Before joining the board, she'd spent nearly a decade working on social impact programs, often in spaces that weren't built to include voices like hers. Her background was in both finance and human rights advocacy, an unusual mix that gave her an eye for both numbers and people. This visit wasn't just another audit. It was personal. Not because Doug Whitmore had made her wait, but because his actions reflected a deeper issue that extended far beyond one moment. Doug started talking again, stumbling through a rehearsed explanation about the bank's high standards and commitment to equality, but Alicia wasn't interested in speeches. She looked to the other board members, all of whom watched silently, allowing her to lead. "I'm curious, Mr. Whitmore," she said, flipping to another page. "How many clients of color have received high-value loans from your branch in the last fiscal year?" Doug blinked. I'd have to check that data." "We already did," she replied smoothly. "The number is 3. Out of 128 approved loans. And of those 3, 2 were under $20,000. The room went quiet again. One of the board members, a man with salt and pepper hair and a stern jawline, looked at Doug without saying a word. The silence said enough. Outside the room, Maya's curiosity got the better of her. She quietly slipped into the hallway near the boardroom and stood just outside the frosted glass, trying to listen without being obvious. She wasn't the only one. Another employee from HR and a security guard leaned near the break room, eyes fixed on the closed doors. Alicia's voice, though quiet, carried authority. "See, numbers don't lie. But sometimes, they hide the truth if no one looks close enough. This branch has the highest customer drop-off rate for minority clients in the region. When we started digging, we found patterns of denied appointments, longer wait times, and several unresolved complaints." Doug looked stunned. We've never had any formal accusations." "You wouldn't," Alicia said, almost sadly. "Because people who experience this kind of treatment usually don't bother coming back." As the word settled, a sense of unease rippled through the staff who were close enough to hear. Some felt guilty. Others felt exposed. But for Maya, it felt like validation, like everything she had sensed but couldn't prove was finally being named. Inside the boardroom, Doug tried to change the subject. "Ms. Carter, I think if you gave us more time, we could make adjustments. I'd be happy to organize a new diversity training." "This isn't about training," she replied. "It's about culture. The culture that's been allowed to form here under your leadership." That hit harder than any accusation. Doug sat down for the first time, the fight draining out of his face. He looked around the table, hoping someone would defend him. But no one spoke. Alicia didn't gloat. She didn't raise her voice. She just let the silence speak. What no one else in that room knew was that Alicia's own father had once been denied a small business loan at a bank not far from here. He was a hard-working man who had never missed a payment, but he was told, politely, of course, that he didn't quite fit the profile. That one denial had forced him to shut down the shop he'd built from scratch. Alicia had never forgotten that. And in some way, maybe that was what led her here. As she gathered her papers, the tension didn't lessen, it thickened. Because no decisions had been made yet. No verdict handed down. But everyone knew something was coming. "I'll be filing a full report with the board," she said, rising to her feet. "You'll be informed of next steps by the end of the week." Doug stood too quickly, fumbling for some sense of control. "Ms. Carter, if I may." "You've said enough," she interrupted softly. And with that, she walked out of the boardroom, her heels once again echoing through the hall. This time, everyone watched her. Not with dismissal. Not with doubt. But with a quiet understanding that something had shifted. Maya stepped back as Alicia passed, offering a respectful nod. Alicia returned it with the smallest smile, one that held 1,000 untold stories. Back at the teller desk, the young man who had ignored her before straightened nervously. He looked like he wanted to apologize, but the words didn't come. She didn't need them. She wasn't here for apologies. She was here to show the cost of silence, and the power of being seen. And the story was far from over. By the time Alicia returned to her hotel room that evening, the events of the day were still circling in her mind. She'd dealt with countless similar situations across the country, branches that preached inclusion while practicing exclusion, but something about this branch felt different. It wasn't just the numbers or the dismissive attitude Doug had shown her. It was the way the staff had reacted, the sideways glances, the silence, the discomfort. They weren't just witnesses. Some of them were trapped in a system they didn't create, yet unknowingly helped maintain. Meanwhile, Doug sat in his office long after everyone had gone home, staring at his computer screen. The reflection of his own tired face stared back at him. On his desk sat a folder labeled "Internal Review, Pending." His pride wouldn't let him open it. Instead, he scrolled through the branch's quarterly reports, desperately searching for something, anything, that might support his defense. But the deeper he looked, the more cracks he found. Client complaints that had been quietly closed. Surveys ignored. Resumes filtered. His heart beat faster the more he realized how many blind spots he'd chosen not to see. Back at the branch, Maya couldn't sleep either. Her apartment was small, the kind of place where the kitchen shared space with the living room. She sat at her table, sipping lukewarm tea, laptop open, typing out an email she never thought she'd write. It was addressed to the board, anonymously. She detailed not only her observations of Doug's behavior, but subtle instances of bias she had experienced herself, comments about how she spoke so well, clients who assumed she was a receptionist, and how she'd been passed up for client-facing responsibilities more than once despite having strong performance reviews. She hesitated before hitting send. A dozen thoughts swirled in her mind. Would they trace it back to her? Would it even matter? But then she remembered the way Alicia had looked at her earlier, like she wasn't invisible. Like she had a voice worth hearing. With a deep breath, she clicked send and closed the laptop. The next morning, the board members gathered in their temporary conference space downtown. The chairman, Mr. Harwood, reviewed the preliminary findings Alicia had provided and placed the anonymous staff email beside them. "This isn't an isolated issue," he said. "It's cultural." Alicia nodded slowly. "There's a reason these things go unchecked. They don't explode, they seep in, little by little. And by the time anyone notices, the damage is already done. As the board discussed their next steps, Doug was already in damage control mode. He called a staff meeting at the branch, trying to keep his tone casual, but everyone could tell something was off. "Just a quick chat about some changes coming from corporate," he said, forcing a smile. "Nothing to worry about." Maya sat quietly in the back, watching him carefully. So did Kevin, the head teller who had been working there for nearly 8 years. He was in his 40s, kept to himself mostly, but everyone respected him. Doug had often relied on him to calm things down when tensions rose. But even Kevin was starting to question things. After the meeting, he pulled Maya aside. "Can I ask you something?" he said in a low voice. "Do you think she's really going to make a difference?" Maya shrugged, unsure how to answer. She made Doug sweat. "That's something." Kevin nodded slowly. "I've seen people like her before. Strong. Smart. But they don't always stick around. The system wears them down." "Maybe," Maya replied. "Or maybe she's the one who'll change it." Elsewhere in the city, a local journalist named Danny had caught wind of the situation. A quiet tip from someone at corporate had landed in her inbox, no names, no details, just a suggestion to keep an eye on the Westfield branch. Danny had a reputation for chasing uncomfortable truths, especially around corporate misconduct and community issues. She'd once exposed a housing discrimination scandal that cost a development company millions. This bank story, if it was as big as it seemed, could have ripple effects. Danny began digging. She started with public data, loan approval rates, customer complaints, staff demographics. The numbers told part of the story. But the real meat would come from interviews. She made a few calls, including one to an old friend who used to work at the branch but left last year. What she heard only fueled her fire. Back at the branch, tensions were starting to show. Doug's assistant, Carla, who had worked with him for 5 years, noticed how jumpy he'd become. He was no longer his smooth-talking self. He paced more. Checked his emails obsessively. Called random meetings that led nowhere. "Something's coming," Carla whispered to a coworker. "I can feel it." Alicia returned to the branch 2 days later for a follow-up. This time, the energy was different. Staff stood a little straighter. Doug's usual arrogance had been replaced with awkward attempts at charm. But she wasn't there for him. She requested individual meetings with each department head, then spent time with several frontline employees, including Maya. Sitting across from Alicia, Maya felt nervous but safe. Alicia asked open-ended questions. No judgment. Just listening. "If you could change one thing about how things are run here," Alicia asked gently, "what would it be?" Maya thought for a moment. "I'd want people to stop assuming we don't belong. Clients, leadership, even other employees. I just want to come to work and feel like I'm part of something that values me." Alicia smiled. "That's not asking too much." As she left the branch again, a storm brewed outside, not rain, but the kind of slow-building tension that comes when change feels inevitable but not yet here. Doug stood at the window, watching her walk away, his jaw clenched. He knew things wouldn't be the same after this. But what he didn't know, what no one knew yet, was that Alicia's report was already in final draft. That Danny the reporter had just booked her interview with a former employee who claimed Doug had once altered loan recommendations to avoid risk. And that Maya's email had sparked a quiet wave of internal staff coming forward, some ready to speak up, others still too afraid. The walls that had protected that branch for so long were starting to shake. And somewhere in the middle of it all, a young woman who had once felt invisible was beginning to realize the power of her voice. The story was nowhere near finished, and the real reckoning hadn't even begun. Alicia's footsteps echoed faintly in the hallway as she made her way back to her car, the overcast sky casting a gray filter across the windshield. She sat quietly for a moment, watching the steady stream of customers entering and exiting the bank's glass doors. On the surface, nothing seemed wrong. But she had seen behind the curtain, and what lay beneath was far from clean. Her phone buzzed in the passenger seat. It was an email from the board. They wanted a full report, detailed, no shortcuts. They were ready to act, but only with the right ammunition. She looked up at the building again, a quiet fire behind her eyes. She knew she had to dig deeper. Inside, Doug was spiraling. His polished charm was wearing thin. He could feel it, like eyes were on him, watching, judging. Even staff he had once relied on for loyalty now spoke in hushed tones behind closed doors. Carla, once his most dependable support, had started clocking out early and avoiding eye contact. It was like she had finally seen the man behind the title. He received a message on his internal dashboard, a request to join a compliance meeting with corporate later that week. The subject line was vague, but the tone was not. Doug's palms felt clammy as he clicked it open. He had faced internal reviews before, but this felt different. It was like the floor beneath him was shifting, piece by piece. At the same time, Danny the journalist was piecing together the puzzle faster than anyone expected. Her article draft was now sitting at 1,700 words, packed with anonymous testimonies, screenshots of public complaints, and even a redacted internal memo from someone inside the compliance department. It wasn't enough to publish yet, she needed one solid on-record voice to break it open. And that's when she reached out to Alicia. They met in a small corner cafe, just far enough from downtown that no one would recognize them. Alicia wasn't used to giving interviews, especially while the situation was still unfolding, but something about Danny's determination struck her. They shared notes, timelines, evidence. Both women had seen this kind of quiet injustice in different forms, Alicia through audits and numbers, Danny through stories and voices. What would happen, Danny asked, stirring her tea slowly, if you found out this wasn't just one branch? Alicia paused. Then the story's bigger than anyone thought. Meanwhile, back at the branch, Maya was called into Doug's office. He said it was about a shift change. But she could feel the tension in the room the moment she stepped in. Doug didn't look her in the eye. He kept his voice even, but there was an edge to it. I need to know something, he said, folding his hands tightly on the desk. Have you been speaking with anyone from corporate, or the press? Maya blinked, caught off guard. What? No. Why would I? He leaned forward slightly. We're all under pressure right now. Things can get twisted. But if there's something bothering you, I'd rather hear it from you. It was a subtle threat wrapped in a fake concern. Maya recognized it. She gave a polite smile and nodded, her heart racing. As soon as she left his office, she texted Kevin. He knows something's up. Be careful. Kevin had been quiet in the background for weeks, but he wasn't blind. He'd started documenting everything, client comments, odd staff decisions, even the way Doug avoided meetings with certain clients. He hadn't planned on using it. But now, seeing Maya stressed, he knew the time was coming. The atmosphere at the branch grew more tense by the day. Customers noticed too. Some complained about longer wait times, others sensed the nervousness in the employees. A few long-time clients, especially ones who had been close to Maya or Kevin, started asking questions. "Is something going on here?" a woman asked softly at the counter one afternoon. "I've banked here for years, but this place feels different lately." Kevin smiled politely. "Just a few changes happening. All for the better." But even he didn't believe it. As Friday approached, rumors of a surprise board visit began circulating. Doug tried to act unfazed, but he couldn't hide his worry. He sent out an all-staff email encouraging positive attitudes and professionalism. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Carla rolled her eyes when she read it. That evening, Alicia received a message from someone she hadn't expected, an HR executive from another region. The message was short but powerful. "There have been similar complaints in our district. I think it's time we talk." Suddenly, Alicia realized Danny was right. This wasn't just about one manager, one branch, or one woman being forced to wait. It was about a pattern, a culture hiding behind the illusion of fairness. And she was in the middle of it. The next morning, Doug arrived at the branch earlier than usual. He wore his best suit, the one he saved for regional visits. He stood by the entrance, greeting customers with extra energy, hoping to mask the storm swirling inside him. He knew that at any moment, everything could crack wide open. Maya kept her head down. Kevin carried an extra folder of notes under his arm, just in case. Danny had just sent her final questions to the bank's PR team, giving them a narrow window to respond before going public. And Alicia? She stood on the other side of the city, prepping the most important presentation of her career. As the clock ticked closer to noon, 3 black SUVs pulled into the bank parking lot. Board members stepped out, along with someone unexpected, Mr. Harwood himself. No one had seen him visit a branch in years. Doug's face paled when he saw him. Clients paused. Employees froze. The air was thick, and time felt like it had slowed down. This was the moment. Everything that had been brewing beneath the surface was about to rise. And just as Doug stepped forward to welcome the visitors, the front doors opened again. This time, it wasn't just the board walking in. It was someone else. Someone whose presence no one had anticipated. Someone who would change everything. As Doug stood there, frozen in a tight smile, trying to maintain composure in front of the board members, all eyes suddenly shifted to the entrance once more. The glass doors glided open, and in walked a man in a dark tailored suit, confident, calm, and clearly not part of the board. But the real surprise wasn't just who he was, it was the reaction he triggered. Mr. Harwood, the senior-most board executive, immediately stepped forward to greet him with a handshake and a rare smile. "Glad you could make it, Elijah," he said. Doug's expression faltered. Elijah? That name hit him like a cold slap. He had heard it before, but it couldn't be. Not the same Elijah who had come into the bank last month. Not the one he had made wait without reason, ignored, dismissed. But it was. Same sharp eyes. Same quiet strength. Only now, Elijah wasn't in sweats and sneakers, he was wearing power. Board members took their seats in the conference room without waiting for Doug. They invited Elijah to join them, not just as a guest but as someone whose opinion clearly mattered. Doug stood outside the door, not knowing whether to follow or retreat. For the first time in his career, he felt truly invisible in his own bank. While the meeting commenced behind closed doors, murmurs ran through the staff like a current. Carla turned to Maya, whispering, "Is that him? The same guy Doug kept sitting out in the lobby?" Maya nodded, her eyes wide. Kevin, who'd caught a glimpse of Elijah earlier, had already connected the dots. He had seen Elijah's name on a confidential client file once, one that flagged high-level assets and special access protocols. Doug had missed it. Or maybe he ignored it, blinded by assumptions. Outside the meeting room, Danny stood near the side exit with her camera crew, recording what she could without breaking policy. Her article was already drafted, but this twist, the millionaire being the same man Doug had disrespected, was gold. It was a living example of profiling and power imbalance. A story that practically wrote itself, yet still carried the weight of truth. Meanwhile, inside the boardroom, things were shifting quickly. Elijah spoke calmly about the experience he'd had that day, without bitterness, but with detail. He talked about how it felt to be judged by appearance alone. How the receptionist wouldn't meet his eyes, how the manager made him wait, and how he was treated differently until someone else stepped in. And then, with deliberate pause, he said, "Now imagine how someone with no connections or resources would have been treated that day." A long silence followed. Mr. Harwood leaned forward. "Thank you, Elijah. That's exactly why we needed you here today." Back on the floor, Doug finally stepped away from the door and walked toward his office, shoulders stiff. He could feel it, his grip on the branch slipping. But just when he thought things couldn't get worse, Carla knocked on his door. "I think you need to see this," she said, holding her phone out. On the screen was a video. A customer had recorded a snippet of Doug's interaction with Elijah the day he was made to wait. It was grainy, but clear enough. The dismissive tone, the forced smile, the lack of eye contact. The video had already been posted to social media, and the views were rising fast. Thousands of shares. Comments pouring in. Words like racism, profiling, disrespect, and accountability were trending. Doug's throat dried. Where did this come from? From the lobby camera feed, I think. Someone synced the audio with their phone video. "It's all over now," Carla said, her tone neutral but firm. Kevin walked in behind her. "Doug, the PR team's been trying to reach you. They're saying it's getting out of control." Doug buried his head in his hands. But the twist wasn't over. At that same moment, Alicia received a file from her contact in HR, one that wasn't supposed to be leaked. It detailed multiple instances from other branches, all involving similar behavior. What made this more damaging was that Doug's name had come up in more than one complaint over the years. Complaints that were quietly dismissed, or redirected with lack of evidence. This wasn't just about what happened to Elijah. It was a pattern. Alicia printed the documents, her mind racing. She knew what this meant. The company couldn't hide behind policies anymore. The story was public. The evidence was mounting. And now, with Elijah's involvement, the issue had the board's full attention. The story was no longer about a single mistake. It was about how the system allowed it to happen. Back at the branch, Danny received a call. The board meeting's ending, her editor told her. They want a press statement ready within hours. You got what you need? More than that, Danny said, watching Elijah walk past the lobby toward the exit, his expression calm but focused. She turned to her cameraman. "Keep rolling." Doug stepped out of his office to see the board members leaving. One of them stopped, looked him in the eye, and simply said, "We'll be in touch." Elijah paused by the entrance. He turned back toward Doug, his gaze steady. "You could have just done your job right," he said quietly. Then he left. Doug stood there, rooted, the noise around him fading into a low hum. The following morning, the bank branch sat unusually quiet. Employees spoke in whispers, some unsure whether to even clock in, others glued to their phones reading the latest headlines. Overnight, the story had gone national. News outlets picked up the video, and hashtags demanding justice were trending across every platform. Public pressure was mounting fast, and the bank's head office knew it couldn't ignore the uproar. Doug arrived late, his face pale and drawn. He barely made eye contact with anyone as he walked straight to his office, but the energy had already shifted. The respectful nods he once received were gone. Everyone had seen the video. They had heard Elijah's name, seen his face, and more importantly, felt the weight of the truth. No one could unsee it. Around noon, an official car pulled up outside the branch. Two high-level corporate executives stepped out. One of them was from the bank's Ethics and Compliance Division. They didn't come in quietly. They asked for Doug by name and requested that he accompany them to the conference room. The staff watched in silence as Doug followed, his shoulders stiff, every step heavier than the last. Inside, the executives laid everything out in detail: the video footage, the HR complaints, the social media backlash, and Elijah's statement to the board. Doug tried to defend himself, claiming he didn't remember who Elijah was, that it was a busy day, that he was just following policy. But the words sounded weak, hollow even to his own ears. The executives didn't argue. They simply handed him a letter, not a suspension, but a termination notice. Effective immediately. The bank was issuing a public apology, implementing new anti-discrimination training across all branches, and Doug would no longer be a part of the company. His name was already removed from the internal directory. As Doug packed up his things in stunned silence, the rest of the staff stood back. No one celebrated. No one gloated. It wasn't about revenge, it was about accountability. And for many of them, especially Carla and Kevin, it was a long overdue shift. Outside the bank, Elijah stood by a black SUV, watching quietly. When Doug walked out with his box of belongings, their eyes met again. Doug slowed, unsure what to say. "I never saw it coming," Doug finally said, voice low. Elijah nodded once. "That's the problem. You never tried to see it all." And with that, Elijah got into the car and drove away, leaving Doug standing alone on the sidewalk, under the weight of everything he'd just lost. But the story didn't end there. A week later, a press conference was held at the bank's headquarters. Elijah, now publicly known as both a philanthropist and major investor in the financial sector, stood behind the podium. He spoke not about anger, but about change. He announced a new initiative, a foundation focused on diversity and equal treatment in the corporate world, especially banking. The foundation would fund scholarships, community programs, and diversity training at institutions nationwide. And the funding for it? It came from Elijah's own investments, including a recent silent partnership he had made with the very bank that once overlooked him. That final twist caught everyone off guard. Elijah wasn't just a client. He was one of the bank's newest and largest stakeholders. He had kept it quiet until now, watching how the system worked from the inside. When he experienced it firsthand, he knew it was time to act. "I don't want an apology," he said during the press conference. "I want better systems. I want respect to be standard, not optional. And I want every person, regardless of color or income, to walk into a bank and be treated like they matter, because they do." The room erupted in applause. Back at the original branch, things began to shift. Carla was promoted to assistant branch manager. Kevin was offered a leadership role in community outreach. Training programs were introduced, and staff began having honest conversations that were long overdue. The branch didn't become perfect overnight, but it became more human. And for the first time, employees felt like they were truly a part of something meaningful. As for Elijah, he continued his work quietly, often showing up to community centers and schools unannounced. He didn't need recognition, the work itself was the reward. But every now and then, someone would spot him and remember the man who waited in a bank lobby for hours, dismissed by someone who couldn't see past surface. And they'd remember how the story ended, not with anger, but with growth. Because in the end, what shocked people most wasn't Elijah's wealth or status. It was his grace. And that changed everything. The weeks following the press conference felt like a shift in the air, not just at the branch where everything unfolded, but in many other places too. News outlets continued covering the story, not just because of the viral video or Elijah's surprising identity, but because something about it felt bigger. It wasn't just about one man being mistreated at a bank. It was about how often things like that happen without being noticed, without any justice, without change. Elijah's calm but powerful response turned what could have been another headline into a real conversation about dignity, race, and how systems treat people differently. Carla sat at her desk late one evening, reviewing some files, when she got a message from Elijah's team. He had requested her to join the advisory board for his new foundation. At first, she thought it was a mistake. Why would someone like him want her involved in something so big? But Elijah had remembered the way she spoke up, the quiet strength she showed in the middle of chaos. He believed voices like hers were essential if they truly wanted change from the inside out. Kevin, on the other hand, had taken on his new role with pride. Community outreach meant more than just public appearances, it meant helping people who often got overlooked. He started holding financial literacy sessions at local schools and shelters, sharing what he knew, and even inviting some of the bank's team to volunteer on weekends. One Saturday, as he wrapped up a session at a community center, a teenage boy approached him and said, "I want to work at a bank one day, like you." That was the first time Kevin realized the impact this whole journey had started to have beyond the walls of their branch. Meanwhile, Doug had all but disappeared from the public eye. He moved out of state, reportedly trying to start over in a different line of work. There were no interviews or public statements, no follow-up articles about redemption. For some, it felt incomplete. But maybe that silence was its own kind of closure. Sometimes, consequences don't need to be dramatic, they just need to be felt, deeply and personally. Elijah continued to operate in the background, as he always had. Despite all the attention, he didn't let it distract him from his mission. He kept visiting local communities, working directly with people, listening more than talking. Every decision he made was rooted in one thing: empathy. It wasn't just about proving a point. It was about shifting perspectives. One quiet afternoon, Elijah returned to the branch, not with cameras or news crews, just by himself. Carla was surprised to see him. "Back to reopen old wounds?" she asked, half joking. He smiled. "Just checking if healing started." They sat for a few minutes at the same table where he had waited all those weeks ago. The branch had changed. There were new faces, updated posters promoting inclusion, and a softness in how people talked to each other. Not perfect, but better. I never thought banking would be where I'd make the most noise, Elijah said, chuckling. Sometimes the quiet places are where noise matters the most, Carla replied. That line stuck with Elijah. Later, when he was speaking at a leadership summit, he quoted Carla's words. He told the audience that real change isn't always loud. Sometimes, it starts in rooms where people are tired, frustrated, and still choose to treat others with kindness. The foundation continued to grow. Scholarships were awarded to students who had dreams but lacked resources. Programs were launched to train bank employees across the country on cultural sensitivity, implicit bias, and respectful customer service. Elijah's story became a case study in business schools. Not because of the drama, but because of how he navigated it, with humility and purpose. Years passed, and the event that once sparked outrage became a turning point remembered with respect. It was discussed not with bitterness, but with hope. A reminder of what could happen when people chose growth over grudges. Carla eventually became branch manager. On her first day in that role, she brought in cupcakes for the team and held a short meeting. She didn't talk about numbers or goals. She talked about people. About listening, understanding, and checking your own biases before assuming anything about someone who walks through the door. Kevin, now balancing community outreach with a regional training role, often came by the branch to say hi. One day, as he was leaving, he looked back and said, "You know, we didn't just get through a mess, we grew a movement." Carla nodded. And it started right here. At this table. As for Elijah, he continued his work behind the scenes. He never stopped investing, in people, in stories, in second chances. He believed that power meant nothing without purpose. And his purpose was clear, to make sure no one else had to prove their worth just to be treated like a human being. Looking back, the story could have ended in so many different ways. It could have become another case of quiet injustice. It could have fueled hate, division, or more pain. But instead, it became a story about strength, grace, and transformation. A story that reminded everyone watching that identity goes deeper than appearance. That a title doesn't make a person important, their actions do. In a world full of noise, Elijah's story stood out because of how grounded it was. It was about a black man with immense power who chose peace when he had every right to choose anger. About a woman who did the right thing when no one was watching. About a team that learned and grew. And yes, about a man who made a mistake and paid the price, but also sparked a long overdue conversation. The most powerful stories aren't the ones that end with applause. They're the ones that leave us thinking long after the screen fades to black. And as this story closed, it left behind more than just a lesson, it left behind a legacy. A legacy of dignity. Of respect. Of quiet power. And a reminder that real change starts with how we treat the person right in front of us.